Overshoot. Now, what is referred to, there's a website called overshoot.org, Overshoot Day. When you take that into account, we are extracting resources from the planet. We are increasing our demand on the planet, while the base capital of it is diminishing. That's why, so every year, the overshoot day comes a little earlier because we are taking these resources out. So in a nutshell, that's what I'm saying. We are running it fast forward against a wall that's in plain sight.
Hello, everybody. Welcome again to Above the Chaos. I'm excited to be here today with Klaus Mager, a good friend and advisor on food systems. We had a delightful catch up here a week or so ago. I wanted to come in and talk about some of the things we've been facing and some of the concerns that Klaus has about the future and some of the opportunities we see together for what we can do together and in local communities to strengthen our food systems and health and resilience of our communities and our bodies, families, environment, all the way through. So Klaus, welcome. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
So why don't you give us just a little bit of your background and where did you come to be interested in and passionate about food systems?
Well, that really started after my retirement, I must say. I worked for 21 years for the Walt Disney Company as a food and beverage director, creative development. So I got to lead teams that develop food systems for theme parks, hotels, entertainment centers. After Disney, I joined a German food wholesaler, Metro Cash and Carry. It's one of the largest food wholesalers in the world, as a head of corporate target group marketing. So in that role, I had teams of analysts in 30 countries. We developed market segmentation strategies, customer identification, customer intelligence, market intelligence, and interacted between our customers and the operating team and procurement teams to deliver the services for specific goals. So I had a chance to travel and do deep dive work in India, China, Russia, Poland, Turkey, Germany, France, literally 30 countries. It was divided into Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Asia. And it was a fascinating job. It was amazing to travel, particularly in Eastern Europe, which went up with 10, 12 years ago. So that was still in a more developmental phase. So I retired in 2013 and I wanted to work as a consultant. So I started taking some courses. I took a course at UC Illinois, Introduction to Sustainability. And that just was when Coursera started. There were 70,000 people logged into that course. And it was absolutely fascinating because I'm trained in metadata, dealing with big data sets and so on. And when I listened in to the basic cycles of what constitutes sustainability discussion, the carbon cycle, water, soil, minerals, and so on, it became pretty clear that what we're doing has an end date to it, because the resource extraction that we take from nature is simply not sustainable. So I've since taken a couple of dozen courses with Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia, with Otto Scharmer at MIT, and so on, and really wanted to understand how does this work, how to get your mind, wrap your mind around this huge system, right? It's $1 trillion part of the economy. And the deeper I got into it, the more concerning this really is, because I think what frames it in a nutshell is that we're using 1.8 times the regenerative capacity of the planet. I mean, I say regenerative capacity, that means take fish stocks. When you fish the oceans faster than the fish can replenish itself, you're diminishing, the stock, the base stock. When you pump aquifers dry that take thousands of years to fill up, that's a finite resource. When it's gone, it's gone. And so topsoil is one of the things. And soil is probably the most important marker to focus on. So think about Japan, think about Europe, China. I mean, these are countries that have lived on their same land for thousands of years, literally. And they haven't destroyed their soil. They haven't destroyed their watersheds. Here in the United States, since World War II, we have literally destroyed 1/3 of our topsoil. Now, it's the topsoil, meaning it's depleted of life, depleted of its microorganism, its microbial life, because of the application of chemicals. So take that overshoot, what is referred to, there's a website called overshoot.org, Overshoot Day. When you take that into account, we are extracting resources from the planet. We are increasing our demand on the planet while the base capital of it is diminishing. That's why, so every year, the overshoot day comes a little earlier because we are taking these resources out. So in a nutshell, that's what I'm saying. We are running it fast forward against a wall that's in plain sight.
Yeah. So let's just spend a little bit more time defining these terms and concepts for anybody that hasn't been immersed in them. So you used the word sustainability. We could use another word called regenerative. So you talked about the regenerative capacity of the earth. So one way to think about any living system is it has some kind of a baseline level of capacity. And let's take just an analogy that's popping to mind of sleep. And so let's say that a normal human maybe needs 7 or 8 hours of sleep a night to function. And so for short periods of time, you can dip into that to borrow more energy from your human being. And you could go, okay, I'm up against a deadline. I have needs. So I'm going to dip in and I'm going to sleep, 5 hours a night for a week. And so what happens is you deplete the base energy in your system and you build up what's almost like a sleep debt, right? So you can't just do that over time and then go back, just spring back up to baseline. You have to then work off the debt that you've accumulated to get back up to the baseline. So with any living system, let's imagine fish stocks that Klaus mentioned. We can imagine that there's a natural rhythm of the regeneration, the continuous birth and sustenance and death of fish stocks in natural cycles that change over the years. So we could need food as a human species and go, okay, we're going to go dip into those fish stocks and deplete them. But once you deplete them, just like if you're depleting your own sleep, you're creating a significant debt where it's going to take a long time in order for that stock to get back up to where it was, let alone to be able to provide for more in the future. And so when we deplete our fish stocks or we deplete the regenerative capacity of our topsoil or any of the water or land or air systems, there's really long cycles that it takes to replenish them. So in the example of sleep, maybe that only takes, you go into sleep debt for a week. And maybe over the course of the next month, you can work that off by sleeping another hour or two a night, and you kind of get back up to the baseline. So when we get into talking about things like natural stocks or topsoil, we're dealing often with ecosystems that have taken, at least millennia to form, right? Deeply enriched, nourishing depth of every year after year for thousands of years, building up the depth and diversity of life, starting with what Klaus called the microbiome. So you could imagine that, so for instance, in your human body, I think a lot of people don't know that. So if you were to imagine your human body and you could think, okay, that's composed of human cells, but actually in your human body, there's more non-human cells than there are human cells in your body. And what those non-human cells are what we call the microbiome. And the vast majority of those are contained in our gut. And so human beings are like our earth, kind of more like a superorganism that's composed of cells and a whole array of other forms of life, microscopic life that are living within us and coexisting with us. And that then those enable a bunch of the basic functions of our life. They enable us to digest food. They strengthen the walls of our gut system. They help produce neurotransmitters like serotonin that keep our minds healthy. They prevent disease, all sorts of things. So that microbiome functioning in a human body is absolutely essential to it properly functioning. And maybe a little bit later today, we can get into some of the health effects that we're experiencing as we destroy the microbiome, not only in our soil, but also that works its way into our own bodies. So Klaus, explain a little bit why, anything you want to add on that notion of, so explain why soil is alive, I guess, like the concept of living, diverse, rich soil and how that's different from dirt. And then explain the process of agriculture that you came to understand, the process of large scale agriculture, and why does that destroy the core life and regenerative capacity of soil?
Yeah. So when you take a handful of healthy soil, there's more microbial life in that soil than there are people on the planet. It's just teeming with bacteria and microorganisms, which then in turn feed higher forms of life. So in a healthy soil, you will see worms and insects, which in turn feed birds and mammals, but they also feed plants, which in turn feed the mammals and birds and insects. And so there is a web of life that really originates inside the soil. And what I have come to think is that if you just focus on the health of the soil, then everything else falls into place. The reason, the way that the soil microbiome gets damaged is with the application of chemicals. So the most prevalent one is synthetic nitrogen. It's made with natural gas. So it's an extraction of nitrogen through a process that burns fossil fuels, natural gas, and the application of herbicides and insecticides made from oil. So these chemicals disrupt the growth cycles. They disrupt the photosynthesis that brings nitrogen and carbon into the soil, deep into the soil, as a feedstock for the microbial life inside the soil. And mind you, I'm not a scientist, so I'm like using layman's terms here, trying to explain this. So when then the other issue is monocropping. When each crop takes different nutrients out of the soil, some crops put nutrients into the soil. So since biblical times, I mean, there are references in the Old Testament about crop rotations and then in the soil rest, basically treating the soil as a living thing, which is what it is.
Yeah.
So you have to nurture it. And when you like I work all over the world, and I've met so many food producers, farmers, and food processors who talked about their soil making their product unique. Whether that's in Italy, where they call these enormous grains wonderful, or the French, with their puff pastries. I mean, they only this flour that only grows in this particular region, and they're grooming their soil generation after generation to stay healthy, right? So we have completely lost this connection, with soil as a living thing. And so we're killing it inadvertently, because you put nitrogen on it and everything blooms for a while, but then it burns itself out. After 2 or 3 cycles, you have to put more nitrogen on it to keep going. And then when you use monocrops, the natural defenses that are in healthy soil also go away. So now you need to use herbicides to fight against invading weeds. You need insecticides, to fight back against predation. And all of a sudden you have a chemical race, which is where we are right now. It is completely, entirely unsustainable. And this is where the idea comes in. Sustainable, we could have talked about sustainable 20, 30 years ago. and shifted our practices to make sure that what we do maintains, the existing capacity instead of diminishing it. It's too late now. So now we need to regenerate the soil back to life. And so in a nutshell, what you can see is that globally, we have lost over 50% of insects. Here in the US, some 70% of insects are gone by weight. Now, so you look at pollinators, some 70-80% of our food requires pollinators to assist. And when you take pollinators out, our food supply is going to collapse. So you have all these little issues there, each one of which should force you to change course, should tell you it's time to change course, and we're not. We're doubling down on it instead.
Yeah. So pulling on a couple of those threads. So Klaus talked about the timeless wisdom and principle of treating the soil as if it's a living thing, because it is. So there's these really interesting, let's call them fractal and cycle relative principles that apply to living beings. So for instance, in the Jewish tradition that Klaus was referencing, there's the idea that of working 7 days and then working 6 days and then having complete rest on the seventh day. And so corresponding to that basic pattern, the basic millennia old understanding of how you properly steward the earth is to work the earth for 7 years, and then for an entire year, let the land just completely rest and recuperate. And so each living thing has a time appropriate fractal cycle for work and rest. That is how God made basic living organisms to function, where you can draw on that creative capacity and you can cultivate and you can produce, but then both humanity and the earth needs a rest because it's living and it has to last for millennia. So there's these, it's amazing when you look back at those traditions and how we're coming to understand them. Okay. So we have the idea of, living earth and soil that has to last for millennia. And ideally what we're doing is we're going beyond, we have a minimum criteria of sustainability. And then, like Klaus mentioned, above that, we can understand how we can actually be regenerative as a species, how we can actually consciously exist in a way that not only doesn't harm and not only sustains, but actually causes the earth to flourish over time. And so we have now, I think, a short window of time and the knowledge and the technology and the global reach and ability to locally be able to apply that knowledge to actually heal and regenerate our soil and our earth. And it's, takes a long time, but when you're dealing with those long time cycles, now's the time to start. So let's go to the issue of, want to highlight one more thing. So you can imagine, let's picture, I just got back a couple of months ago from the rainforest down in Amazon. And so when you're walking through the forest, you can see the life that's built itself up largely uninterrupted for millennia. You have, 1,000-year-old trees that are giant and, roots that are 30 feet tall to trees that are hundreds of feet tall that are then nurturing the whole thing. And the amount and density of life and insects, every inch of soil for as deep as you can probably think is just teeming with life. And so the key thing to understand that Klaus was saying is life builds itself up from the bottom, not from the top down. And so we have the basic idea, let's say, of mass energy equivalent. And so you have something fundamental like energy, and all matter, all what we perceive as matter is really associated energy. And then you have information in the universe that it instructs that energy how to associate and disassociate into form. So you end up with life building itself up according to the instruction manual given by God and reflected in the DNA of all these different creatures. And so then you end up with energy associated into the basic elements that allow the microbiome to come into being, the simplest of being, the viruses and the bacteria and all those different things. You have the different kingdoms. And then on those, life rises up into more and more complex forms. And so everything kind of eats the thing below it. And as much of that next life form can exist as there is diversity and abundance in the substrates beneath it. And so you get this gradual layering up of life. So what Klaus was saying about the collapse of something like insect populations is so crucial. So Klaus, remind me of the stats that you said on collapse of insect populations in the U.S.
It's as high as 70%.
Something like 70%. I saw recently a study that they did of similar of insect populations in Germany near national parks where you'd expect them to be relatively robust. And it was showing something like the same, something like 70% collapse in the amount of insects by mass and weight, let's say, right? Okay. So something that we're doing as a human species is causing the collapse of 2/3 of insects. And so it's like maybe smart to think, okay, why is that happening? When you look at the other studies on wildlife and biodiversity, it appears that 2/3 number is pretty pervasive. Like the studies seem to show that in many areas, approximately 2/3 collapse is about average for what animal populations are experiencing as well. And so those numbers match from top to bottom because life is building itself up consistently. So you can imagine that if we severely damage and destroy something like 2/3 of the microbiome, that's what's supporting ultimately the plants and insects and life that are trying to cooperate and thrive there. And then that's in turn making its way up into the birds and animals. And so you have this rising collapse of roughly 2/3 of life, which is like an apocalyptic scale. So we should be thinking really hard about whether that's going to keep raising its way up. And if we're doing something that's that destructive, that it's destroying 2/3 of life, what makes us think that that's not rising up? So those are a couple of the threads there. So let's talk a little bit about food prices and food shortages. And you mentioned to me the other day that you're concerned with the potential for relatively rapidly cascading food shortages. We've been talking about that with some different groups over the last year or so, that there seems to be a reasonable potential that the rising food price crisis that we're seeing could easily spill over into shortages of food, which then have all sorts of obviously catastrophic impacts. So tell me a little bit about what makes you concerned about our food supply chains and the availability of food over the next years and decade.
Well, when you look around the world, just at this very time as we speak, Libya just got wiped out, with the storm. Before it was Greece. So even just in Europe, you had several countries with devastating climate impacts. China, India, devastating floods. Pakistan, last year 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. So when we see these events, and think about here in the United States, Florida, they have this massive storm going across the center. We look at the houses and the cars floating down the street, but we don't put the camera onto the farm fields that got wiped out. There are very large areas that where the crop just got destroyed. It's either underwater or it's blown up. So that's one thing, that these storms disrupt the agricultural cycle and at the very least, drastically reduce yields. That is happening in a world that has increasing demands on food because we're still growing. World population there is still growing. The demand for higher value food like dairy and meat is still growing in many of the second tier countries, China, India, and so on. So you have these conflicting patterns here. But what is also really disturbing is that the industry has settled on these types of monocrop farming, as we mentioned before, that are so destructive. And in order to increase yields, they have to put more nitrogen onto the fields and more phosphates, which run off into the rivers and into the watersheds. And they actually contribute to the devastation that we see, not just on the field itself, but also around it. Now, so the biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity that we see is mostly due to runoff from farm fields. And then it's an arms race. That means the more we monocrop and fertilize fields with mines, phosphates and minerals and synthetic nitrogen, the less productive this gets. So you have to apply more chemicals, because you have disrupted the natural cycle of soil to replenish itself, which typically is being done by always having a root in the ground, by using cover crops, by rotating crops, because each crop has a different impact on the soil and so on. So there is just no, there is no exit ramp here inside, because the industry has completely specialized itself to working with these highly programmed products. Like there's a certain potato that McDonald's needs. It has to be this kind of potato, and it's amazingly destructive on the soil, on the environment, and so on. But if you are going to Idaho and you're asking the farmer, look, guys, we need to change what you're growing to restore your soil, they may say, look, there's potato species that will do that will help us, but they don't fit into the supply chain. So meaning the challenge we have is that the system has locked in to a vertically integrated process structure where you can't change anything without changing everything, right? Yeah. So when you think about transporting food over thousands of miles, if you want to reduce the transportation cost, then you have to decentralize the production, right? Then you have to change the production centers and so on. So everything is linked. And this is the challenge that we have right now, to make change at scale is highly disruptive to the existing business models. And these business models are all operating top down, highly centralized, ginormous supply chains. And it is going to be a challenge for these companies. And some of them may not be able to adapt to the requirements of a decentralized regenerative food system. And that's why we have, political challenges here.
Okay, so let's talk about centralized and degenerative and decentralized and regenerative conceptually. So you could imagine conceptually, let's say we don't have McDonald's and we don't have Kroger and we don't have Costco and we don't have Walmart. We don't have these massive groups purchasing massive quantities of uniform things, right? So the alternative is that you have a decentralized array of local communities operating in their own places with the regenerative harmony and balance of the unique place that they're in. And you tie together a locally regenerative, sustainable farm to table food system that moves a little bit with the seasons. And so throughout the course of a year, depending on what's available, the different restaurants locally are using that local produce and they're producing a variety of different dishes that change seasonally. And you're working in harmony with nature and the local area in a locally adaptable, decentralized way, not dictated by central authority. So that looks like one thing for the farm system, let's say here in Idaho. Where that gets pressure, whether it's food systems or manufacturing or anything, is once you have, let's say, a McDonald's and a Walmart that come into town, you have the same basic dynamic happening. So to switch metaphors really quickly, let's imagine the same thing with local manufacturing. And let's imagine that you have a diverse, decentralized local manufacturing economy where you have lots of craftspeople and small shops and smaller manufacturing centers distributed widely with their own practices, making locally appropriate things and exchanging them. What happens when Walmart comes into town and then is sourcing mass quantities of uniform things at very low prices with very high turnover or obsolescence, is you switch and you end up buying those Walmart monocrops, whether they're food at Walmart or whether they're products at Walmart. And you end up putting a lot of pressure on the local producers who, if they're going to now supply, have to completely try to change or go out of business to meet that shifting consumer expectation. So back to the food systems, I don't know what the stats are, but if you imagine the amount of a certain kind of potato that McDonald's needs to serve everywhere around the world simultaneously every day, 12 months a year, 24 hours a day, you end up putting this massive drive to produce that one thing. And so then you end up with the giant agricultural companies working to meet that need, whether it's potatoes or whether it's corn or anything. You have the agricultural giants. So educate us a little bit on the agricultural giants like Monsanto and other of that ilk and their impact on food systems. How has that evolved over the last 40 or 50 years?
Well, the probably since Reagan, it's but really post World War II, the growth mentality of companies is constantly seeking out to make more money. I mean, I work corporate, right? So every year you get an end budget. You have to increase profit 8%. How you get there, you got to figure this out, right? So then you every year this gets more complicated, and then you start coming up with some pretty crazy things that you shouldn't be doing, but you're doing them anyway because your job depends on it, so kind of thing. So there is a level of centralization which I was part in. I mean, when we moved to Hong Kong, it opened up all kinds of supply chain opportunities, cutting out the middleman, buying factory direct for a fraction of the cost, and so on and so on. But you took out all these brokers and middlemen along the way. And so companies get bigger, and there is no mentality in place where is enough, or can we like flatten out and stay here for a while, or it just has to be more every single year. Now, and so that nature abhors conformity, right? I mean, nature is not monogamous. Nature wants diversity, and anything that becomes monogamous, it gets attacked, right, and brought down. It's just the nature I mean, it's just how nature works. So to change this now, there are a lot of applications that should be centralized. It doesn't make sense, for example, to build irrigation technology in every community, right? It's perfectly fine to have a few global players, like the Israelis are phenomenal, with the irrigation technology. And so use that and make it accessible to the community. So there are tools and process structures that should be at the meta level, because that's just the most intelligent way to develop these things. But at the local level, you need to apply those things in the way that your particular community needs it. So the core issues of regeneration is, first of all, what's your soil, right? So what type and condition of soil are you dealing with? Your soil is different in the Pacific Northwest than it is in Kansas or Florida or California. So you're dealing with your soil. Then you have your local climate. even microclimates. Right? They bring certain conditions to the plate. Then you're dealing with access to water. Is it readily available? Are you in a desert environment? So what exactly, can you do with water? And this is completely ignored by the industrial sector. It's the socioeconomics of the community you're dealing in. So socioeconomics of your workforce. It's the political environment, the local political environment, the regulatory frame you're working in. It's what people like to eat. Maybe you have a different demographic in Louisiana than you have in Oregon. Yeah, so people have different preferences. So all of that combined sort of dictates the frame of what the farmer can work with. Because it's not just about changing your crop to restore your soil. It is also having a market for that crop to be sold into profitably, right? So you have this balancing of developing types of crops that can find markets. But now comes the challenge here, because at this point, the definitions of what gets grown where are top down, right? And then chemicals overpower local challenges, climate, weather, water, whatever. Use a GMO seed that's specialized for this, whatever. So in order to regenerate, you have to turn that thing upside down. And now the farmer dictates, here's the range of things that I can grow. And guess what? The cranes that I'm growing in the Pacific Northwest may be a different subspecies than what you're growing in Kansas or in California. So it doesn't fit, the standardized bun that you're working with, or, whatever the products you're using with flour. So it challenges these homogenized manufacturers, with the need to decentralize their supply chain and then customize their recipes and products to regional specifications. It totally can be done. And you will, once there is enough impetus here, you will find innovators and you will find companies who see the light here and they just go and do it. But so far we haven't reached that point yet where companies recognize that.
Okay. So let's take another little case study to illustrate some of the workings of the food system. So I have a good friend who's sold a lot of the eggs that we eat on the West Coast. And so he's been deep in the egg industry for a long time. Okay. So let's imagine that in California, we want to evolve our standard of the kinds of eggs that we eat. So let's imagine that a group puts on the ballot a referendum that says, do you want the chickens that are producing the eggs we eat in California to have more space or be cage free and be treated in a better way? And so let's imagine that we vote yes. Okay. That's really difficult because of these centralized and interconnected supply chains. So Klaus was talking about the localization and the adaptation. You said the farmer dictates. You could also say that nature dictates, right? There's this sure. window of what nature will tolerate. And then let's say that ideally those who are cultivating the ground are acting as stewards and representatives, intermediaries between nature and the consumers of food that are making the market for what nature can tolerate regeneratively over time and in what seasons, and the people in the local community that want to eat. And so one of the things that's happening is we don't realize the extent to which these giants are absolutely dominating the systems and making these things a lot more complex to change than we think. So for instance, you could say, okay, well, the farmer should change and do something regeneratively. And then instead of selling to, Walmart and McDonald's, he could sell to the local farmer's market or co-op or whatever it is. So, Klaus, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those kind of small co-ops and farmers markets and regenerative attempts currently constitute something like 3% of the food sold in America. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So basically let's imagine that 100 years ago, something like that, that was probably 90+%, right? Basically, everything was local. Is that correct to say?
That's pretty much correct. Yeah.
Okay. So then it's really just been post World War II. Like we kind of picture this reality we're living in as if it's always been that way. And it's really just, World War II, where we really learned to like do a great job circumnavigating the globe with giant ships and having global logistical supply chains and being able to move people and products and weapons, around the world at scale. And so coming out of forging those logistical capabilities really through the world wars, for the first time in history, as we get into, let's say, the 50s and 60s, and then really into the 70s, we're learning about that rapid beginning of globalized supply chains and centralized supply chains built off of our centralized military mindset and infrastructure, let's say. So then we kind of learned, okay, well, just like we can build a big military to go set up supply chains and do things around the world, we could build big corporations to go set up supply chains and do things around the world. I just got off a call where someone was giving a rant about his observation that as human beings, it seems like we have a really hard time conceptualizing what these giant corporations that we've created are. So he gave the example is, we kind of tend to look at Google or Monsanto or some giant corporation as if it's a person, like with maybe a personality and a conscience, and maybe we could like send it a communication and it would communicate back, and it would like us or it would hate us, but it would operate with some kind of almost a human-like moral conscience. It doesn't appear that's what's happening. We've created essentially these soulless giants, legally established solely for the purpose of getting larger and creating monetary benefits for their shareholders. And then we back that with a legal system that makes it the legal obligation of everybody cooperating that soulless giant to make it larger and richer every year. So that essentially leads to this unchecked growth of soulless monsters that increasingly centralize things and have no consciousness or qualms about the destruction of the earth and local communities' integrity in order to do that, in order to keep up that growth, right? So that's a recipe for disaster. Okay, so back to this egg issue. So Californians voted to that they wanted to consume across the state cage-free eggs. What we don't realize is that if California decides that it wants to consume cage-free eggs, because of the centralized systems and because 97% of the supply is going through these centralized supply chains, that essentially forces every other state to ultimately convert to cage-free eggs. And so that one decision of the largest state in an empire to convert to cage-free eggs in a democratic referendum that nobody understands sets off essentially a $15 billion rebuild of, 70% of the egg infrastructure of America, because Walmart and Kroger and Costco aren't capable of dealing with differentiated egg types in their supply chains. So they don't really have the infrastructure set up, just like McDonald's can't tolerate 16 different types of local variety of potatoes because people want to go in and get the exact same one every time. The big distributors have essentially those same requirements where they logistically can't tolerate diversity in their supply chains among something simple like eggs. And so you end up driving these massive changes. So what have you come to find out? That's a little bit of my exposure, direct exposure from people working with state governors and things on those issues. What have you come to find out or understand about the disproportionate role that centralized logistics and distribution from the giant corporations plays in driving this?
Well, we already mentioned the difficulty that these companies have to decentralize their supply chains. I mean, in fact, you may have an egg producer in Vermont ship all his eggs to Chicago, and then and then the stores in Vermont get delivered back the eggs that just came from Vermont in the first place, right? I mean, the way the system is, the supply chain is only intelligent in a way that it provides the most effective distribution, but it has a huge carbon footprint. It prevents you from anything local. So I mean, it's a monstrosity that has evolved because no one ever paid attention to the externalities that are coming with it. Which is the reason why the food system is actually accountable for 1/3 of global emissions. When you take agriculture in itself, that's maybe 10, 11%. But then when you add on, transportation, refrigeration, storage, the manufacture of fertilizers, deforestation, and so on, it is really the elephant in the room. And there's no way. Yale just came out with a study saying that if we don't radically change the way we grow food and make significant changes to our dietary patterns, we'll fly right beyond any kind of climate objective we have. The food system alone will contribute 0.7 to 0.9% Celsius temperature increase. So there's that.
So go ahead.
But then, where do you go with this? So USDA has started to really emphasize what they call the Title II conservation programs in the Farm Bill. And the Inflation Reduction Act just allocated $19.5 billion into these programs, which are notoriously underfunded. And these programs are really designed to help the farmer to start regenerative practices, meaning you may put in a cover crop, you may rotate your crop, you may put in a pollinator buffer, a watershed repair and things like this. So these are stacked benefits that the farmer can use. But then also you need to rebuild the supply chain because the industry has taken out systematically all the processing capacity, the brokerage functions that enabled a local or regional food system. So for example, the meat markets, 80-90% of US meat markets are controlled by 4 companies. One is a Brazilian, one is Chinese, mixed ownership on the others. And so they took out all the small abattoirs. So when you travel in Europe or in Asia, every little town has their own butcher. All the smallholder farmers can bring in their animals and get them processed, and it's sold in the local markets at very reasonable cost because the supply chain cost is zilch in this.
Yeah.
But it opens up an important revenue stream for smallholder farmers because they can feed their animals with byproducts that now go to waste. Leftover products in the fields, outer leaves of cabbage or salads. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Or you can grow food, for your poultry and your pigs. And so to rebuild this local food system really requires, a community supported effort. So I'm actually doing a panel discussion in Bend here this evening. We're showing the Kiss the Ground movie, and then we have a local panel, and we're talking about the tens of thousands of meals, even in our small town, that we have to serve for free to people who are hungry and can't feed their families, that can't feed themselves. So how is this normal? Why can't we grow food for these local folks? Last year, the U.S. government spent $183 billion on nutritional assistance programs. Where's this money going? It goes to Kroger, it goes to Walmart, it goes to the big actors, it goes to Cisco, and they don't buy anything local. So the government gives money to the community and they're taking it right back out. Where if this money was used to feed a local infrastructure, now the neighborhood impact kitchen could buy from a local farmer And that money starts rolling inside the community. They can organize a local processor, or an aggregator, to make this work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the federal government is, go ahead.
So tell me more about the way that, so when you travel through other countries, like you say, it's sometimes alarming because you're traveling down the road and there's, animals hanging along the road from all the local butchers, right? So you have this very tight supply chain, right? Where when you say the supply chain costs are near zilch, you're essentially generating and consuming food in a single bioregion. And so whereas a lot of times if we go to Kroger or Walmart and we look at where our produce is coming from, it's being shipped from a foreign country. It's being shipped from a foreign country, and it's like it's the antithesis. So you could measure, I guess, something like the length of supply chains, right? And the other thing that we should talk about, just getting back to the potential for food price escalation to turn into food shortages, I'm not sure what it is. I think that the latest stat I saw is something like 1 billion people are currently in reasonably severe food insecurity, right? One in 8 people throughout the world. And so the length of these supply chains, for instance, in Africa, where we've been trying to understand and do a little bit of work, a lot of those communities have been, what do I want to say? Fraudulently ensnared, let's say, into consuming these massive amounts of their food from these globalized supply chains. And so you could imagine that Russia and the United States and China, for instance, are doing everything they can to push out local food production and consolidate supply chains and get the products of Monsanto, if it's US, Bayer, if it's Europe, and whatever Chinese companies doing the same thing, basically getting those supply chains hooked into those consumer markets. And when they do that, they flood those markets with cheaper alternatives, cheaper, toxic, chemical laden, health destroying, and local economy destroying alternatives to what can be produced locally. And people, without understanding that they'll be destroying their local economy and regenerative capacity, go for those cheap international food products, which then increasingly drives, food products or manufactured products, which increasingly puts the local producers out of business. So it's kind of this vicious cycle where once that happens and then you displace more of the local food production, that creates additional demand on the centralized products that are waging their chemical war against the regenerative capacity of the earth, something like that.
Yeah, the nature.
Why do you call that? Go ahead.
The nature of why this is possible is because it's extracted. So if you don't pay attention to what this does to nature, if you abuse your watersheds and your soil, and you take minerals out for next to nothing, then you can do this. But there's an end game here. This is not sustainable, means cannot continue in perpetuity. Right? And we're coming to that end phase much faster than people are ready.
Yeah, let's say there's a principle like something that can't last forever will come to an end. And so you can attempt to cheat the laws of God and nature for a little while. We've been maybe doing it at an increasingly high rate of speed for something like 40 or 50 years. But once you exhaust all the soil, there's a forced reset. So we'd be pretty smart to consciously change before the forced reset comes. Why do you call that a chemical race or a chemical war? Describe in more detail the imagery in your mind when you're describing a chemical race or a chemical war that's getting increasingly more intense.
So think about fields of thousands of acres of corn. I mean, there is as much land under cultivation for corn as the size of California. It's phenomenal. Yeah,
massive.
Um, so
receiving massive billions of dollars of wasted subsidies as
exactly. Well. And, pumping groundwater that's irreplaceable in the process to make biofuel and feeds for animals, mostly. So, so you have this crop, and now you have the invasion of weeds, because for the weeds, this is like bonanza, right? Wide open. There's no defense here, so we can attack this. So the first thing they have to apply is a herbicide. So now they're already building herbicides into the seed itself. They're also making these plants herbicide resistant. That means they can douse the field with glyphosate, Roundup, and it doesn't harm the food plant, but it kills the weeds. Well, laws of nature, you kill 1,000 weeds, 5 survive and replicate. So the next time around, you have weeds that are tougher and need a higher dose of herbicide. So you play that game and you're in an arms race. So now all of a sudden, go ahead.
So it's going in two different ways. Okay. So people may or may not know about pesky weeds, that they're there for a reason. And if you imagine a dirt field, nature often doesn't want things to be dirt. Nature wants to propagate and grow. And so you don't go from a dirt field to a beautiful, diverse, flourishing pasture full of a diverse array of plants and insects and birds and wildlife. You start with dirt, and weeds play a very specific function. Weeds, let's say that God created weeds in order to go first. And so they are the tough soldier plants that go first into those barren areas in order to come back in and start to regenerate. And as the weeds proliferate, then eventually, if they're left unchecked, the soil starts to rediversify. The microbiome starts to come back. Klaus, correct me where I go wrong. The other more diverse plants come in, and the healthier that soil becomes, the more rich, diverse the bio becomes, the more different types of plant life are supported, insect life, bird life, that bring back all the other animals, and you start to regenerate the soil, then the weeds naturally go away because it's not their turn anymore. So something like that is the function of weeds, right? So when you say, so it goes in two directions. What defends against weeds in nature is flourishing, abundant, healthy soil doesn't need weeds. That's basically correct, right?
You could, maybe we're trying to create pictures to explain it. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's something like that. So the more, so let's say the first time you go through and you mass drop Roundup and douse all the food that's going to be going into human beings' bodies, along with everything on the ground, that Roundup that the seeds that the plants have been genetically engineered to be resistant to, the Roundup then goes down and indiscriminately kills the weeds and everything else. So you could imagine that if the Roundup is strong enough to kill the toughest weeds, it's also strong enough to kill the very fragile microbiome. And so every time that happens, you're depleting the healthy soil that is the defense against the weeds. So the next year, you have less defense. And like Klaus said, the weeds that survived were the toughest ones, most resistant to the chemicals. So then those are the ones that reproduce. So you're in an arms race where you're getting tougher and tougher weeds with less and less defense. And so the same thing can be seen happening, for instance, in the antibiotic races, where we intervened in nature by indiscriminately prescribing antibiotics for so long. Those indiscriminately wreck people's microbiomes and body. The things that survive those antibiotic onslaughts are stronger ones. And so basically you're selectively breeding stronger and stronger pathogens. And then we're doing the same thing with the soil.
Yeah, and the same applies for insects. And then all of this bleeds into the food supply. So today, some 80% of American women have glyphosate in their breast milk. There's glyphosate in urine samples. The hormones that are being used for animal production, they're adding hormones in it, have an impact on puberty disruptions in children. Now you have 8-year-olds who are starting to menstruate now, and you mentioned already, like 70% of antibiotics are prophylactically given to animals because they're living in such challenging environments. They get sick, so they feed them antibiotics, which is very dangerous because they're basically breeding antibiotic resistant strains, which would be very difficult for us to deal with. So this whole thing just screams unsustainable.
Yeah. Okay. I want to come back really quickly. You mentioned 80% of women having glyphosate in their breast milk. I was just on a call with a doctor this morning who was talking about these same issues. He happens to be a specialist in brain health. So my understanding is that over the, since 1970 or thereabouts, let's say, we've ramped up these processes. And so we're using more and more chemicals in our chemical war because of this cycle that Klaus is describing. And as a result, we've had to gradually increase the amount of residual Roundup that's allowed to be in our food supply. And so I don't know the exact number, but my understanding is we've something like doubled that over the last few decades, where we used to say that X amount was allowed. And then as we're in this chemical arms race, having to put more and more on to feed our unsustainable food systems, the government has to keep raising the amount that's allowed. If you look at the charts of what's happened over, since 1970, if you look at diabetes, if you look at obesity. So the doctor this morning was telling me that, something like 2/3 of Americans are obese or overweight. Something like 2/3 of Americans are diabetic or pre-diabetic. And his take is that all comes directly back to the same issues of food system. So when we think about the cost of what we're doing, it's so easy to silo these issues. So now the United States is spending an exorbitant amounts on its healthcare systems as people are getting sicker and sicker. The other crucial thing to understand about glyphosate in our breast milk or in our gut microbiome. So these things pass through multiple generations. It's not that we could just consume these toxins and then our own body deals with them. They have multi-generational effects because they're passed from a mother passes on microbiome to a child.
Right.
And so what happens, let's imagine that cycle Klaus was talking about, where we're in these increasing cycles where every year we have to use more and more chemicals. So you can imagine these fields of wheat, let's just say, or corn or whatever it is, getting doused with Roundup. Glyphosate is the active branded ingredient in Roundup. And so that's then doused. The harvesters and combines then come by and just take all of that crop that was doused with glyphosate. That gets mass processed and then makes its way into our cereals and bars and breads and everything we eat. We then consume that, and that glyphosate is still active and goes in and starts destroying our microbiome, just like it destroyed the weeds and the microbiome of the plants, and makes its way into breast milk. And so key is we're looking at these massive increases in chronic disease. And so that's entirely coming back to these same farming practices. It's also the same root cause of, well, one of many, but it's one of the principal root causes of, the mental health and depression and anxiety, because that serotonin, I forget what it is, 70 or 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut, actually. So when we're ingesting these glyphosates and destroying the healthy microbiome in our bodies, that's having these profound impacts on our own bodies and our brains and our mental health. And then we're passing that on to the youth. And so maybe the last thing I'll say on this is that this doctor was getting me up to see this morning that there was recently a large study released looking at stool samples from healthy people and then Alzheimer's patients. And so what you're seeing in people with these brain diseases is that almost universally there's severe lack of diversity of microbiome, including several specific strains of bacteria that are needed for healthy gut and brain function that are being wiped out by these farming practices. And he was saying that the evidence is mounting for those same things being witnessed in the stool samples of people with autism and a lot of other of these rising issues that we're seeing. So they're hard. It's hard because it's so abstract, but we don't realize that like every one of our days and our bodies and our family members is directly affected by this.
Yeah, I mean, the medical associations, they are saying the disconnect between, for example, farm bill incentive allocations and what the dietary guidelines is phenomenal. We're spending money on things we already don't need, and fruits and vegetables we don't spend the money on. In fact, there is in 2022, the U.S. was a net importer of food, if you can believe this. We have a trade deficits in agriculture, and we're importing most of our produce, fruits and vegetables from other countries. Yeah, so how does this make any sense is hard to believe. Medical Association will say that 2/3 of the American healthcare bill is nutrient related. So if you figure that you have a $1 trillion food economy, that causes $1 trillion damage in healthcare and then $1 trillion damage in environmental rectification. So it's an incredibly damaging way to do things, and it's incredibly hard to change.
It's amazing too to hear you talking about the agricultural deficit. Just a week or two ago, I was reading that the Biden administration is currently trying to force Mexico to take all this genetically modified and chemical laden corn that we're producing, and Mexico doesn't want it because they don't want to poison their population, presumably. So then the Biden administration is getting into these deep coercive negotiations to try to at least push it into the food supply of their animals. But all that stuff makes its way up through the system. So that's one of the other just absolutely somewhere between atrocious and evil aspects of these giant centralized corporations is not only are we destroying our own environment and food systems and body, but then we're using the massive political and military might of the United States to basically shove it down the throats of the rest of the world in extremely coercive manners that very few understand. I was talking with someone who was in the office of one of the African presidents and cabinets as they were getting ready to sign a deal with Monsanto. And he was like, do you guys realize what you're signing and what that's going to do? And so they talked through it and fortunately ended up, backing off that. But we have, massive political pressure on countries around the world to poison their populations with these things we're producing too. Okay, so that's pretty dour. So basically, we're destroying the planet. We're collapsing our topsoil. We're collapsing the microbiome. That's causing the collapse of something like 2/3 of insect populations. That's rippling up into the collapse of something like 2/3 of animal species. We're in an increasing arms race and doing that at a more and more rapid rate as the corporations grow larger and larger. And then we're using political and sometimes military intervention to export those destructive technologies around the world. So, Klaus, what should we do about it?
So I think the most promising tidbit of information that is circulating right now is related to what is called the small water cycle. And let me try to explain that. About 60% of local rain really comes through a process called evapotranspiration. That means you have water coming into a watershed or into a bioregion. By the way, the term bioregion is really important. We sort of went over it, but to separate to separate bioregions by what you should be growing in there and how that should work is an important aspect. But anyway, so soil will hold water, absorb and hold water in direct relationship to its soil microbiome. So the amount of organic carbon in the soil determines how fast the soil can absorb water and how much it can hold. For every 1% increase in soil organic matter, it can hold 20,000 gallons of water per acre. Wow. So when you have 4 to 10% typically in healthy soil of organic content, 5% means the soil can hold 100,000 gallons of water per acre, right? So that water then evaporates and it comes back down as rain. So this local process really creates what the weather system that we're used to. Now imagine those millions of acres of farmland have been dried out and the soil microbiome has been damaged and the soil can't hold any water. So now you have prolonged periods of drought because this local rain has ceased to function. And when it rains, it really comes down in a more massive way because the soil absorbs heat and reflects heat. Right? So when the air warms up, it can hold more water. So when water comes, it goes down. And this is what we observed in California, for example, right? Where you have prolonged periods of drought, and then when it rains, it really dumps. And when it dumps,
and then because the soil is depleted, it can't absorb that water, and so it just runs up.
So now you have flooding, right? So that is finally sinking in now that you actually have a natural way of tempering our climate by putting roots into the ground, restoring your soil, and stimulating this local regional water cycle, the small water cycle. So what it does when you have vegetation on the ground, it actually cools, has a cooling effect. So whereas dried out soil that is barren has the opposite, has a heating effect, right? So it amplifies the impact of climate change. So I think as that sinks in, I was just communicating this with several groups because all of a sudden I had this aha thing going on. Everybody knows it, but we haven't connected what it really means.
Connected it,
right?
Okay,
so
I try.
Go ahead.
I try to triangulate towards answers as we're trying to figure all this out. I just want to give another triangulated evidence of this. So I was just down in the Amazon a couple months ago where the local tribes are ringing the alarm bells as fast as they can, saying that they think we're reaching a critical deforestation tipping point. And the alarm bells that they were communicating to me were exactly along the lines of what you're saying on the local water cycle. So there's the local water cycle that Klaus is talking about where you have water going up into the air and coming back down and remaining in a local place. Amplified out at scale, then you have kind of the, whatever you want to call it, the heart and lungs, the pulmonary system of the earth that's moving water around the earth and massive currents that are in the oceans and in the atmosphere. And so our understanding is that, the Amazon rainforest functions something like, kind of that heart and lungs of the world. Pump, the pump that's moving things. Okay. And what the indigenous tribes are trying to warn humanity about is that because of that exact local weather cycle that you talked about, every day, each of those trees in the rainforest draws from its roots and from the rivers and tributaries to the Amazon, massive amounts of water up through it and releases it up into the air. And then that direct local water is what rains back down and creates the local rainforest. It's exactly the same dynamic that you were describing. So their understanding and experience is that in a given domain, if you deforest something like 25% of it, you wreck that local water cycle and you start kind of the catastrophic unwinding of the system. So you can imagine that it's all healthy. You could deforest 1% around the edges and you don't break the local water cycle. You could then imagine at some point you hit a point where it starts to unwind itself and the weather patterns are changing too much. And so anyway, it sounds like we're doing that same thing here in the United States that we're doing down in the Amazon.
On a
Those
massive
affect
scale.
both local and global system. Yeah.
Yeah,
Amazing.
but my hope is,
Okay.
this is salvageable, right? And this, we can put woods into the ground instantly. So I had somebody ask me yesterday, I was in a presentation with a different group, and they said, well, how fast can we do this? I said, as fast as your intentions drive you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, the solution. Let's talk about the conceptual solution that we've been discussing over the last years. We could talk a little bit about the local examples of where you and others are trying to work on that and the opportunity to expand it. So I'm going to do my best to actually, you know what, let's start with a story first that might hold the space a little better than the concept. Would you describe for us the process that you went through when you were working in those different countries to go in and map local food systems and support their interconnection, right? So what we're going to talk about here in a minute is how we can decentralize and relocalize food systems on a bioregional basis. And I think your background and experience helped me understand that. So would you describe for us a little bit kind of what you would do in your role through those 30 countries and what your experience was going in and connecting with the different producers and consumers and distributors and mapping those systems and seeing the gaps and how you kind of came to understand how that can work locally?
So the company that I was working for had over 700 locations in 30 countries. You know, we had over 6,000 salespeople in the field attached to each store, and each store had a region that we're servicing. And sometimes we had clusters of stores, like go to Istanbul, there may be 7 or 8 stores that work as a cluster to match different regions and so on. But each store manager had the ability to purchase as much as 30% of his SKUs in the local market. And the reason we were doing this, we were operating, in India, in Pakistan, in Vietnam, in China, in at the time, Eastern Europe, which was very raw, 12 years ago or so. But also even in the advanced countries like France and Germany and so on, we found that people had loyalties to local producers. So, for example, like in Germany, there's a family-owned dairy in this particular town, and they are delivering in a circle of maybe 100 miles, if that, right? And you have, if you want to cater to this particular market, you got to have their products on the shelf, because otherwise, people are to be, the local population is loyal to these local brands, and that's a unique mindset, which we don't have in the U.S. But we found that. So my thing was, I had a team of 2, 3, 4 analysts in each country, and they were MBAs mostly, not necessarily foodies, but we would go and look for types of customers that had similar buying patterns. So let's say take out pizza, or a kebab stores and things like that. And then we would go and say, so how many of those are in our region? Okay, that's a good segment to go after. There may be 50 restaurants that sort of match this profile. Let's go and figure out what really makes them tick. And then we would go and take one of the most successful ones, give them some incentives, and then we would take inventory in the store. What do you buy from whom? How much do you pay? What are the pack sizes? What is the quality? What makes your product unique, in this market? And then we would go
Okay.
to the procurement team and say, okay, here, we need to make some changes to our assortment. And we would go to the operating team and say, we need some service adjustments here because this is how these guys work. And so that was basically the core thing. So I would go into the wholesale market to meet with manufacturers who were unique, local, producing, certain, whether there was dairy or flour or rice or whatever it was. Foxy, I'm sorry, I just kicked up my. So that brings the awareness now to this bioregion concept. Now, how in this particular market, they have been, if you go to India, my God, they've been there for thousands of years now, and everybody knows each other, and this is the kind of rice we eat here, and this is the spice mix we are growing here, and so on. So Western companies then come in, and a lot of them have very disruptive models. Like in India, for example, Walmart coming in, Monsanto coming in, and the first thing they want to do, is buy up a whole bunch of farms and have them shift into monocrops, use GMO seeds, use nitrogen, and so on. Created a mess now in not just India, but also in other countries. And many countries can't defend themselves. India is pretty strong, pretty tough. But you have other countries that they're just completely helpless against this.
Why can't they? What do you mean they can't defend themselves? And why do you use that language?
Because their political structures are too. They don't have any institutional defenses. They don't have a Department of Agriculture and a Department of Transportation and so on. Everything is very loose and power is too concentrated. So they come in. Hey, you're rich, we make you richer. Why don't you take this franchise and you own the franchise, you're the franchisee, but we'll tell you how this all works. So they're basically corrupting the local economy with this process.
Yeah, exactly. So the giant U.S. corporations backed by U.S. political pressure are out actively corrupting the weak institutional structures around the world that they can predate upon in order to go in and open up another tentacle of these centralized supply chains, which they control, that goes back to the manufacture of the genetically modified seeds that can withstand the chemicals that are tied back to oil and all the way back through the thing. Yeah. And so what I think a lot of people don't realize is the United States, on behalf of these corporations are out seeking actively to corrupt government structures in absolute violation of the basic values and ideals that most Americans profess verbally to uphold. And then our elected officials and deep state that's collusively intertwined with the big corporations is then bringing political pressure to bear if the transactions can't really be forced. And then when we look at our sad history, we see, occasions of CIA and military intervention on top of that to, do coups or turn over leadership if the existing governments can't be adequately corrupted to extend the tentacles.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate reality.
Okay, so based on your experience and our aggregations of our best attempts to triangulate and get an understanding of how we could help people turn things around in their local communities and bioregions. This stuff is so damn complicated to try to explain with words, but let's try a little bit. Okay, so you talked about earlier that we have an existing system that's way too centralized and way too uniform, to an extent that it's absolutely antithetical both to the laws of nature and the basic values that all good people hold. And we know that it's actively destroying our soil. It's actively destroying our microbiome in our bodies. and it's actively destroying our brains, and it's leading to these cascading problems in both health and environment that eventually result in a wall of mass destruction. So we know we need to change. Okay, so let's talk about how we can change. So first of all, I guess there's the recognition that the solutions absolutely are not going to be originated by the corrupt giants of government and politics and corporation and oil and finance, whose entire growth and domination of the supply chains is contingent on them continuing. So that's, I think, a first major step, is to go like, why doesn't the government do something about this or whatever, is just to understand the degree to which corruption and collusion permeate those systems. And when you have more lobbyists in DC than you have politicians, and an absolute corrupted system dominated, it's not obvious how, we didn't even talk about the farm bill, but Klaus has been working on farm bill, et cetera. It's not obvious how you create change from above. So we can do our best to press on the levers of government and shift legislation and expose the deep collusive corruption and all those things. And we can and should do that. There's also, I would guess that there is a massive wave of plaintiff lawsuits probably getting ready to fly as it becomes more and more self-evident that every single family in America is being consciously poisoned, and our country consciously destroyed for future generations in the pursuit of power and wealth. That should lead to massive legal backlash. But the quickest lever we have is to educate and make people aware of the depth of these things, and then equip and empower individuals and families to change their consumption patterns that pressures the system from the bottom, and then equipping localities to relocalize and regenerate their own communities and bioregions. Okay, so let's imagine that we have a geolocated map of the 10 million communities on Earth where people live, and let's imagine that's rooted in community. And so you could make a minor modification of that would reflect bioregions. So I'm not sure we have the map and the geolocations of the 5 or 10 million places where people live. We also have the maps of bioregions, but let's imagine that there's 10 or 20 million bioregions. Each one of those is unique and different. So if we as a human species want to stop inflicting upon ourselves the destruction that's leading to the vast majority of humanity being afflicted with disease and destroying the regenerative capacity of the earth, then we would need to change in a very wise, responsible way without destabilizing the food systems that are currently keeping us alive, right? So it's really kind of an interesting, nuanced, dangerous moment where you have these centralized systems and supply chains. And if you try to enact a mass change rapidly in an unwise way from the top down, or if there's geopolitical conflicts and wars, such as in Ukraine or different places that are producing a lot of the food for the world, those centralized supply chains are easily disrupted by geopolitics, let's say, that can have severe rippling impacts. Okay, so if you have overly centralized food supply systems that are destroying the world and are vulnerable to the high likelihood of geopolitical conflict at scale we seem to be marching towards, and if for all those reasons we're likely to have food shortages, then essentially what we want to do, both from the standpoint of self-preservation and logic and cleaning up and regenerating our earth for future generations, is we want to relocalize supply chains and increase the strength and resilience of local communities so that they're not dependent on toxic, poisonous, long, corrupt food supply chains that are destroying their health and local environment, but rather have a flourishing, abundant, regenerative, vibrant, free, non-corrupt local food supply system that allows them to flourish. Okay. So now let's imagine that we time box that. So we as a human species who don't want to suffer and die, want to regenerate and relocalize and decentralize our food supply chains. And maybe while we're at it, our manufacturing supply chains, and maybe while we're at it, our systems of governance. So all of those things that have grown corrupt and collusive and centralized need to be decentralized like rapidly. And so if we wanted to do that in 10 or 20 million places, time boxed over, everybody can debate how much time we have, but let's say we're in a 7-year window of opportunity and crisis where, by 2030, we need to be well on our way to changing our trajectory with millions of places in the active process of regeneration and learning from one another and relocalizing and rediscovering how to produce and consume and feed ourselves and manufacture and all the things that we've abstracted out and centralized. If you want to do that millions of times in a short period of time, one of the first things you realize is you can't centralize it or you're going to fail. So we don't want to create the same thing of trying to establish a top-down mandate to do that. However, let's say we spread this information rapidly enough and enough people spread it rapidly enough and enough people around the world wake up quickly enough and realize that we're destroying our family's health, our own bodies, our brains, and our environment, and passing that on multi-generationally through our reproductive cycles, and that we want to stop that. Then all of a sudden around the world, you've got millions of local communities waking up, realizing that they've been victims of fraudulent and corruption and exploitation, and deciding they're going to take back their sovereignty and responsibility and authority over their systems and lives and bioregions and set things back in order. Okay. So then you have to go, okay, if 8 billion, 2 billion families and spread through 10 million different places want to undertake this collectively, we could try to figure it out locally. We could try to say, okay, 10 million places are just going to have to figure it out for themselves. But I think as we've traveled around the world, we see that's hard. And in a lot of places, we lack the knowledge, and the knowledge is actively concealed by corrupt authorities who don't want people to have it. And so it's not realistic to try to reinvent the wheel from scratch and figure out all these principles in 10 or 20 million places over 7 years. So then you have to say, okay, if we have 2 billion families living in 10 to 20 million places, each of whom wants to work together locally to regenerate and strengthen their supply chains and systems, how could we set up an infrastructure and a program to help and support that effort? And so that's where Klaus was saying, okay, you have things like irrigation technologies that are highly advanced in some parts of the world and highly primitive in other parts of the world, and which are crucial to helping, right? So that's one thing where you could say, okay, let's establish a prototype of the top kind of generalized process and solutions that it takes to recreate a regenerative local food supply chain. Let's take the very best irrigation technologies and the ability to access those via distribution, and let's put them in this theoretical prototype. And now there's a resource up there. Knowledge is another thing we could put in that program. So there's a whole bunch of knowledge contained in a distributed array of organizations about the general process that you would go through, let's say, to map a food system. And for local communities who have never mapped their food system before, those templates are helpful. And so you put that up there. Okay. So you end up with this total like prototype that's a kit of parts, let's say, an interoperable kit of all these different elements that could help and benefit any one of 20 million local communities. And then basically what you need is what Klaus called innovation brokers. But let's say you have these knowledge and solutions that could be the difference between life and death in 10 million different communities, but we're detached and we don't have access to them. So basically, the design that Klaus and I have been talking about over the last period of time is you'd basically train representatives or whatever you want to call it. Brokers is a crass term. Brokers of these innovations, or coaches, or whatever you want to call it. People who understand the prototype in this total basket of solutions, but are also humble enough to understand that they don't have the answers and don't understand the locality, but to go in and work with these local communities to map their systems and understand basically the vision for a regenerated local microbiome and a stable and resilient local food system that's operating in harmony with nature, that sets up their children and grandchildren's grandchildren well for the future. You have the future of what that looks like. We have the knowledge and understanding that so many places don't have of the degree to which these corrupt, poisoned, centralizing systems are destroying capacity. So you have the list of kind of patterns of life that we want to instantiate that are good for our families and our communities and the earth. And then you have the centralizing patterns of death that we know are poisoning us and robbing the planet of its regenerative capacity. So that creates kind of a start doing and a stop doing list. Then you have your analysis of the current state, the mapped analysis of the current state, like Klaus would do when he would go into these dozens of different countries with teams to go map and analyze what's there. And then that basically sets up this gap for local transformation from whatever its current state is to, the better patterns of regenerative local agriculture that create local health and resilience and flourishing. And then you have this total basket basically of solutions that can be brought in just in time, that whole array of different tools and resources and knowledge and coaching organizations and mentoring and all those different things that can be brought to bear just in time as the community kind of works through that roadmap. And the place that I want to extend and I guess cross-pollinate from this conversation with Klaus is that in my conversations with doctors on medicine and care, these things go hand in hand because our food systems and our health are so related. So when we bring in, hope and knowledge and support, hopefully, to places that are suffering in sickness and destructive food systems, there's going to be health problems there too. And so that same, innovations brokerage can start crossing different domains and not just bringing the knowledge of food systems in, regenerative food systems, but also how that relates to integrated health and well-being and why they're so crucial. And so that same, system can not only aid and assist communities in developing flourishing and abundant local agriculture, but also in aiding communities and some of the coaching and mentoring and support and knowledge and infrastructure to relocalize vibrant health systems. And then when I talk to educators, it's the same thing. We mentioned the classic advice that you can find in the Bible, but there's verses in there like, my people are suffering and dying for lack of knowledge. And so, as I've traveled to dozens of countries around the world, it is so encouraging and magical to learn from those cultures and to understand how much we don't know and how much there is to exchange. And then you also look at some things that are happening and just go, oh my gosh, there's so much suffering here that could be alleviated too with the exchange of knowledge. And so basically the design that Klaus and I have been talking about and that we've been working towards is networking together the leading, solutions, knowledge, wisdom, technologies into something like a prototype that contains all these different aspects of knowledge and health and well-being and agriculture and self-governance and all these different things that communities need to flourish, and then allows for those to be localized and adapted with help from trained supporters to any local community that hears about these issues and requests help, right? So, Klaus, where did I what can you add to that vision of how we could successfully address this?
Well, I'm a great believer in a free market economy. Sure. But with the caveat that this free market economy has to operate within constraints. What the one thing, there's nothing that can turn this around faster than people who are incentivized for personal gain to do the right thing. Yeah. Now, much of our incentives are completely misallocated. They have been corrupted. I mean, the big food fight over the farm bill is basically who gets the money, and it's going to a lot of the wrong places. But if those incentives were allocated to help people, to reward people for providing the ecosystem services that we need, now just pay them, then that's the correctly allocated incentive structures. Then the other part, of course, is there is benefit in centralized knowledge. So I'm right now working with AI. I'm working on a ChatGPT project to write sort of a manual of here is where we are. And it's phenomenal how AI is adding to this process. But then, so I'm using CREO and spiral dynamics to develop a communication structure that helps people process what we are facing here without losing hope, right? Because you don't want to discourage people. You want to say, we can do this. During World War II, some 40% of fruits and vegetables came from what was it called? The home gardens, right? That was called the victory gardens, right?
Right.
And so we can do this. I mean, we can absolutely turn this around if we can engage at community level, at bioregion level, to have people collaborate, come together and understand what this is, and have a collaborative superstructure from government and corporate, to help that process. So that's where it is. That's where the auctions are. But you can tell when you look at the political process how hard that is going to be. So you have to have communities step up to the plate, and you have to support and assist innovators, right? If there's the group coming together and say, hey, we'll take care of aggregation, we'll do contracting. Here's this local hospital. They have volumes that are way too much for 1 or 2 or 3 farmers. They may need 50 farmers to come together to supply them. We'll take care of it. Now we'll aggregate the cost of farmers. We'll take care of contracting, logistics. We'll find the process and the subcontract processing so you get your product in the right condition. It can be done. And so exactly. But it has to be undertaken with optimism, with joy, because we can change our food system. I mean, think about these wonderful cuisines from around the world, which have harmonized their consumption patterns, their dietary patterns with their natural environment. Think about Japan, think about China, France, Italy, the Mediterranean. There is a program at Harvard University. It's called Menus of Shade. So they have partnered with the Culinary Institute of America to train chefs to go into a bioregion, do an assessment of what's available in the local market, and then create a menu out of this. That's what we can do. We have the skills
and how
to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. And how that morphs through the seasons, right? I mean, you can imagine that the delight of locally sourced food changing through the seasons. And yes, there's a sacrifice from the mono food that we're used to eating, but there's a whole joyful delight that can be found in, refiguring out how to balance ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay. So we, for anybody that's interested in this, Klaus and I and others in the network have been discussing this in various fractals and groups over different lengths of years, depending on which of us you're talking about. But we think we have a viable vision and a plan. And not only have we sorted out the strategy and tactics and essentially the process side of how it could be rolled out. But we've also built the open, non-cancelable technology to set up the repositories and then onboard local groups to start learning and exchanging knowledge. And then we have basically the rest of the infrastructure in place to be able to increase the amount of services and support that we're providing. That technology has been tested through its alpha and beta sections by something like 300 orgs and maybe organizations and maybe 500 projects in 50 something countries. And so it's a small drop in the bucket and a small start, but at the same time, it's being very actively developed and received and tested around the world. So our opportunity now is basically to start to aggregate knowledgeable people and resources and solutions and partner organizations, and then start more actively engaging in and supporting a few prototype local transformations that we then engage in a regular rhythm of sharing information out. And so Klaus is going to be traveling in South America for a while here. He'll be back in October or November, and then is going to be diving into the next phases of prototyping and Bend. And we're discussing what it would look like to identify several other anchor localities that could be cross-pollinating and sharing knowledge through some of the technology and process that we've built. And so we would love to get some resources and support and engaged interest around these issues. So if you would like to participate in that, I would love if you would drop me a note. You can email me at the letter J at lionsburg.org. If you would like to participate and help fuel these efforts, you can go to www.jordannicholas.org and click Join the Movement. That'll structurally connect you and make sure you're getting regular updates as we go through next stages. And Klaus, if people are interested in exploring more of your work and some of these concepts, do you have anywhere you would direct them to?
Yeah, we have a YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel is called Climate Systems Solutions.
Beautiful. We'll drop a link to that in the show notes if you text it to me.
Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. So Klaus, what a conversation. That was intense and engaging and flew by. Anything else that you would like to insert or share or get into hearts and minds of interested people out there?
Yeah, no, I mean, we live in interesting times, as my Chinese friends would say. I mean, it's stunning to think that our generation is actually the one that stands on the precipice of where humanity is going to go, right? Because the time we have right now determines where humanity will be in 30 years, in 50 years, in 100 years. And it could be going into any direction. You know, it's completely, and as Einstein loved to say, being survival is optional. That's probably the best way to summarize now where we are at this point.
Yeah, it's so amazing, this moment in history where the choices that we make over the next 7 to 10 years, compounded with the inbreaking superpowers of technology and driven to the end of their logic ever more rapidly, could create a future that's so much better than we could possibly imagine. And then we could also look at how, if we use all this inbreaking technology and weaponize it to accelerate the rate at which we're corrupting and exploiting each other in the earth, how we could create quite a hellish situation that could take many generations to recover from. So, man, I feel like it's our duty to be ringing the alarm bells as rapidly as possible, getting as united as we can in our understanding of where we're at and what the possibilities are, and moving as rapidly as we can towards collective action to stabilize things in our own lives, our own families, our own bioregions and communities. And if we get enough people around the world doing that quick enough and supporting one another and exchanging wisdom and knowledge and infrastructure and technology, I mean, we could turn this entire thing around in a single generation. So that's the vision and hope. So please join us. And if you're aware of interested people, resources, support that would be interested in this conversation, please share it and encourage them to follow along and to connect with Klaus or I. When Klaus gets back in 6 weeks or so, we'll be evaluating follow-up actions. Klaus, if you're up for it, maybe we'll have another one of these conversations to hear about your learnings over the next couple months, and then talk more about next steps based on what materializes.
That sounds good. Thanks, Joe.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.